Continuing the Paladin offensive tree, we dive into one of the more interesting corners, the 4 damage auras. This is mainly because their utility is almost entirely at the fringe of the Paladin builds, being either extremely strong starter builds like the Holy Fire Paladin, very specific use case builds like the Lawbringer or Sanctuary Paladins, or extremely expensive late game builds like the item-based Auradin variants. The only real drawback of these builds is that they're very selfish compared to other auras, since most of the boosts only help the Paladin. Needless to say, to get their full potential late game, you need to know what you're doing. So in this video, we're going to mostly cover how the skills work as active abilities, but stay tuned because I'm also working on a second video for these and other auras, thanks to items like Dream, Dragon, Lawbringer, etc. having their own special mechanics and not wanting to turn this into a 30-minute video. Though before we dive in, I want to give special thanks to all the patrons, channel members, and Twitch subs whose continued support has helped make this entire series possible. That aside, let's jump on in. Starting out, let's start at the top with the cornerstone of one of the best builds for sweeping through normal, Holy Fire. At first glance, it may seem like a super simple skill, dealing fire damage in a radius every 2 seconds, and adding fire damage to your attack, and of course being bumped up by its usual elementally tied synergies. And for the most part, you would be correct. Though being fire, it does get a few interesting perks, ranging from simple stuff like benefiting from plus fire skills on items like Mage Fist or Hexfire, to more interesting perks such as how with exploding arrows, the fire damage applied to the weapons will also apply to the fiery explosions. Not to mention on melee attacks, if you use this with items like Rainbow Facets, the percent boost to fire damage is applied twice. Once to the base boost, and then again to the actual attack, though sadly this is a melee-only effect. Moving down, we have what is generally considered the more party-friendly damage aura, that is unless you're playing with a necromancer friend, and that is Holy Freeze, which as you can tell by the name does cold damage in a radius and adds cold to your attack, but it also has the effect of chilling your enemies, and I phrase it that way very intentionally. Basically, this is because the aura does not apply a cold effect, but rather specifically a slow effect tied to a hidden stat called Chill Effectiveness. This means that items that provide Cannot Be Frozen, as well as even being just cold immune in general, will do nothing against it, but rather it is only able to be negated by enemies with 0 chill effectiveness, which is only available on certain monsters. Oh, and of course, it won't apply to act bosses because that would just be broken. Also, much like Holy Fire, plus percent skill damage stacks twice on melee attacks, and similarly, the cold damage from Holy Freeze will travel with freezing arrow explosions, much like the Holy Fire did with exploding arrows. The last of the elemental damage auras is Holy Shock, which, as you can guess, applies much like Holy Fire and Holy Freeze. It deals its damage in a radius, it applies to weapons, and with the percent increased lightning damage, it will get twice stacked bonuses on melee, though unlike the previous two, it doesn't really have any abilities it can travel along with as far as its explosions, so no, it does not get to make Lightning Fury even scarier. Though it is kind of funny that the highest level one of the elemental auras is by far the simplest in terms of effects, with its only unique feature being the usual high max damage, bare bones minimum damage of lightning, just kind of like throughout the game. Now you may be saying, that's just 3 auras, this guy right here said 4 damage auras, and you'd be right, there's one more, this one dealing magic damage with a bunch of its own rules, the most well known being the part that says it only affects undead, and that is Sanctuary, an exceptionally buggy skill in Legacy that has slowly been getting repaired bit by bit in Resurrected. This odd aura deals magic damage to hostile undead in the radius, also knocking them back, only really being reduced by the magic resistances on the enemies themselves, which are few and far between. With patch 2.4, the magic damage added to the character attacks has supposedly been fixed, though it is only so important since the skill also has the ability to pierce undead physical resistance, though in its own special way. Basically, Sanctuary checks the enemy physical resistance at the moment of attack, and if it is greater than 0%, it reduces it to 0%. If it's less than 0%, it leaves it alone. So if, for example, the enemy is amp damaged and has negative overall physical resistances, Sanctuary's piercing will do nothing to it and leave it at that negative amount, where if an enemy is physical immune, it will strip that away entirely and reduce it to 0. Though interestingly, this only applies to the actual attack, not modifiers like, say, Crushing Blow, which will continue to have no effect on physical immunes. So, do you run any damage aura builds? Are yours actively used or are they tied into items? And did you know that with the right item setups, you can get each of the radius effects to apply multiple times over at high levels? Mention it down below, and of course stay tuned for the video explaining that last question.